The last king to die on the battlefield in Britain, he was the last in a long line of rulers, particularly north of the border, to meet their end in such a manner. He is generally regarded as the most successful of the Stewart monarchs of Scotland, but his reign ended in a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Flodden. His marriage in 1503 to Margaret Tudor linked the royal houses of Scotland and England. It led to the union of the crowns in 1603. We now look at the story of James IV, King of Scotland. James was the son of King James III and Margaret of Denmark. He was born in Holyrood Abbey. As heir apparent to the Scottish crown, he became Duke of Rothesay. James and John were his two younger brothers. By 1474, his father had arranged his betrothal to the English princess Cecily of York, daughter of Edward IV of England. Yet James's father was not popular within the family or country, to the point where he had faced two major rebellions during his reign, and there was certainly no love lost between him and his younger brother Alexander Stewart, Duke of Albany. His betrothal to Cecily of York came to nothing, but interest in an English marriage remained. His pro-English policy was very unpopular and came back to bite him when he failed to make agreed dowry payments during the marriage negotiations. The English invaded Scotland at Berwick in 1482 by Cecily's uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, in the company of the Duke of Albany. In a twist of events, James had raised an army to quell the invasion. Unfortunately for him, they rebelled against him. James was taken away and imprisoned by his councillors. It wouldn't be the first or last time James had got things completely wrong. James IV's mother, Margaret of Denmark, was clearly a more popular figure than that of his father. Although his parents were estranged, her sole responsibility was to raise their sons at Stirling Castle, but Margaret died in 1486. It would be 2 years later and a second Scottish rebellion that broke out, but on this occasion the rebels nominated the now 15-year-old James as a potential future leader. Now father and son would fight it out for the crown of Scotland. On the 11th of June 1488, two armies met at Sochiburn, and the battle would claim the life of James III. Prince James would now take the throne. A new era was begun, and James IV was crowned. Although James always felt guilt for the death of his father, it has been suggested that he never wanted any harm to come to him. Although he was not directly involved in the killing, he decided his only way to come to terms with his grief was to do a penance. So each Lent, for the rest of his life, he wore a heavy iron chain sackcloth around his waist, next to the skin, on which he added extra ounces every year. James IV quickly proved an effective ruler and a wise king. He defeated another rebellion in 1489 and took a direct interest in the administration of justice, and finally brought the Lord of the Isles under control in 1493. For a time he supported Perkin Warbeck, who was a pretender to the English throne, and carried out a brief invasion of England on his behalf in September 1496, demolishing Heaton Castle. But then in August 1497, James laid siege to Norham Castle, using his grandfather's bombard, Mons Meg. Over time, James recognised war would not solve his own problems. It would only be peace between Scotland and England, and a way forward that would benefit both countries. Diplomatic relations were set up and treaties signed, and finally in 1502 James signed the Treaty of Perpetual Peace with Henry VII. This treaty was sealed by his marriage to Henry's daughter, Margaret Tudor, the next year, in an event portrayed as the marriage of the thistle and rose, the flowers of Scotland and England respectively, by the great poet William Dunbar, who was then resident at James's court. Although now terms with England had been agreed and peace had come to his country, James also maintained good relations with France. This caused a little distress for English diplomats. Rumours began that James was about to renew the old alliance made in 1295 between the kingdoms of Scotland and France for the purpose of controlling England's numerous invasions. Henry VII had concerns over the matter, to which he sent Thomas Wolsey to speak directly with James.
There was never a man worse welcome into Scotland than I. They keep their matters so secret here that the wives in the market know every cause of my coming.
Nonetheless, Anglo-Scottish relations generally remained stable until the death of Henry VII in 1509. James though knew he had to strengthen his forces, and the need to build a fleet capable of giving Scotland a strong maritime presence. 2 new dockyards were constructed, and a total of 38 ships were built for the Royal Scottish Navy, including the Great Michael. built at great expense at Newhaven near Edinburgh and launched in 1511, which was at the time the largest ship in the world. James IV was a true Renaissance prince with an interest in practical and scientific matters. He granted the incorporation of surgeons and barbers of Edinburgh a royal charter in 1506 and turned Edinburgh Castle into one of Scotland's foremost gun foundries and welcomed the establishment of Scotland's first printing press, Chapman and Myler Press, in 1507. He built a part of Falkland Palace, the great halls at Edinburgh and Stirling castles, and furnished his palaces with Scottish royal tapestries. He was also a patron of the arts. This included many literary figures, most notably the Scots Macars. This was a term from Scottish literature for a poet or bard, more often thought of as a royal court poet. These were diverse and socially observant works that conveyed a vibrant and memorable picture of cultural life and intellectual concerns of the period. He also gave his backing to the foundation of King's College in Aberdeen by his Chancellor William Elphinstone, and in 1496 he also passed what has been described as Scotland's first Education Act, which dictated that all barons and freeholders of substance had to send their eldest sons and heirs to school for a certain time. In May 1493, John MacDonald, who was Lord of the Isles and was a pivotal figure in late medieval Scotland, yet he was forfeited by the Parliament of Scotland. King James himself sailed to Dunstafnage Castle, where the western chiefs had made their submissions to him. John surrendered and was brought back as a pensioner to the royal court. The Highlands and Islands now fell under direct royal control. In October 1496, the Royal Council ordered that the clan chiefs in the region would be held responsible by the king for crimes of the islanders. This act for the governance of the region was unworkable, and after the Act of Revocation of 1498 undermined the chiefs' titles to their lands, and so resistance to Edinburgh rule was strengthened. James waited at Kilkerran Castle at Campbelltown Loch to regrant the chiefs' charters in the summer of 1498, but few of the chiefs turned up. At first, Archibald Campbell, the second Earl of Argyll, was set to fill the power vacuum and enforce royal authority, but he met with limited success in a struggle with his brother-in-law, Torquil MacLeod of Lewis. Torquil was ordered to hand over Donald Douve, heir to the Lordship of the Isles, to James IV at Inverness in 1501. James waited, but Torquil never came. In September 1507, Torquil MacLeod was besieged at Stornoway Castle on Lewis, and Donald Douve was captured and imprisoned for 37 years until he was released in 1543. He died in 1545. Torquil MacLeod died in exile in 1511. The Earl of Huntly was richly rewarded for his troubles, a price that at the time James was prepared to pay. When war broke out between England and France as a result of the Italian Wars, James found himself in a difficult position as an ally by treaty to both France and England. Since the accession of Henry VIII in 1509, relations with England had worsened, and when Henry invaded France, James reacted by declaring war on England. James summoned sailors and sent the Scottish Navy, including the Great Myrtle, to join the ships of Louis XII of France, and so joining in the War of the League of Cambrai. His hopes were to take advantage of Henry's absence at the Siege of Terouanne. On Sunday the 4th of September, James himself led an invading army southward into Northumberland. James and the Scottish army had taken up a position at Flodden Edge, a hill to the south of Branxton. On 9th of September 1513, the battle began in late afternoon, but it proved to be one-sided. Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, gathered an army of about 20,000 to oppose him. It would be James's final battle and one of the worst Scottish military defeats of all time. By nightfall, the Scottish army was annihilated. James was killed alongside many of his nobles and several churchmen, which included the Archbishop of St Andrews. The disastrous Battle of Flodden was a major blow to the realm of Scotland. The fact that James left an infant son to succeed him took Scotland out of international politics for a decade. A body thought to be that of James was recovered from the battlefield and taken to London for burial. James had been excommunicated. In reality, the excommunication was in retaliation for James' support of the French, who were at war with the papacy, of which England was an ally at the time. And although Henry VIII had obtained a letter from the Pope on the 29th of November 1513 to have the king buried in consecrated ground at St Paul's, the embalmed body lay unburied for many years at Sheen Priory in Surrey. James's bloodstained coat was sent to Henry VIII, then on campaign in France. by his queen Catherine of Aragon. Although James' body was lost after the Reformation, which led to the demolition of the priory, John Stow, an English historian at the time, claimed to have seen it and said the king's head, with red hair, was removed by a glazier and eventually buried at St Michael, Wood Street. The church was later demolished and the site redeveloped many times. Today it's occupied by a public house. James IV had a sad and ignominious end, for he was one of Scotland's most charismatic warrior kings, but perhaps it is he who will have the last laugh. Maybe one day, if an archaeologist has an idea to go and look for him, as the pub under which his head is said to rest is not called the King's Head, but the Red Herring. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you'd like to watch some more amazing and compelling stories, then join me today and benefit by subscribing and unlock a quality step-by-step look into the world of remarkable stories from times gone by. Check out both of these videos coming up on your screen right now, and I'll see you next time here on the History Roadshow.